who will moderate the panel, I would like to ask everybody of you to sign our golden book. So just a signature here, if you have as we do usually, and as soon it is done, Gerald will take the floor. And just to speak, you have to push the button in front of you, in front of the microphone. So, Gerald, I let you follow.
Okay. A very warm welcome also on my behalf to this press conference on giving a voice to victims in the United Arab Emirates. My name is Gareth Stark. I'm the Secretary General of the World Organization Against Torture, which some of you may know, some of you might not be familiar at the same time. So I just say it's a Geneva-based organization dedicated, as the title says, to eradicate torture in the world, but as a global civil society network against torture. And it's a pleasure to moderate the session today and to facilitate the discussion. I will say a few words about why we are here today, but the real purpose, I think, is to give the voice to the victims, as we announced. We have 4 people who have suffered torture personally in the United Arab Emirates, and I think it's important that we hear their stories before we round up, also with Maître Membré to my left, that many of you will know here in Geneva as a notariété, so to say, on torture and on universal jurisdiction. Just a word of practicality, you will see that there's translation in the back of the room. It's actually translation from English to Arabic for those who want to follow rather in Arabic. I also would like to say that those of you who want to ask questions in French, we can translate and see that we get answers on that in French as well. I will quickly pass to the speakers and introduce them before each of them speaks, but I just wanted to say a few words about why I think we are here today. And I think there are probably 2 main reasons. One is more a sort of formal one. You have next week at the UN Human Rights Council next door the session of the Universal Periodic Review of the United Arab Emirates on their compliance with human rights law. There were a number of engagements that they have taken in 2013, very few of which have actually been implemented since. We've also had the UN Convention Against Torture being signed and ratified by the country in 2013, yet we still wait for the first ever report to be submitted to the UN Committee Against Torture. So those are sort of formal reasons, because there is a discussion ongoing here in Geneva, and I think it's important that the reality on the ground is heard also for that discussion. But I think the more important reason is really to give a voice to victims of torture. I think, having been here in Geneva for some time, sometimes you had the impression that the Gulf region more broadly is sort of an extraterrestrial, outer space on human rights. It's countries that increasingly actually engage at the UN Human Rights Council, at UN mechanisms and procedures, yet they are actors, but they're hardly acted upon. And I think that we have to change. There is no more a sort of outer space on human rights where we say the rules are different for a Gulf country than for others. These countries have accepted universal human rights treaties like the UN Convention Against Torture, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be held to the same standard that they have ratified in doing so. I mentioned the UPR in 2013, and I just wanted to give a little bit of context the way we see it as the World Organization Against Torture. We have seen in the region broadly improvements. We have seen over the years a broadening of space, more and more people speaking out, organizations on torture being created. And we see that space, unfortunately, closing down the last couple of years again. For those of you here in Geneva, you may well remember the case of the human rights offender Ahmed Mansour, who has received the Martin Ennals Award for Human Rights Offenders in 2015, who soon after has been arrested and is arrested since in incommunicado detention without access to a lawyer, with extremely limited access to the family, and we're very concerned about this case. but it's only one out of many where state security speech offenses are used in a rather open way to go against dissent. Less known, and this is the topic for today, is the issue of torture. Not only of human rights defenders, but of a broad range of different people, of different strands. And I think this is the topic we want to discuss with you. We believe that this deserves more attention, the role of the security services, the total absence of any safeguards, access to lawyers, known locations when the state security services are involved. And you will hear 4 testimonies on very different life stories in a way, but in terms of what they endured and the actors involved, the lack of safeguards, you probably see quite a bit of similarity. And we believe this press conference is therefore needed to shed a light on what is the reality on violations in the country, especially on torture and impunity. I think those stories have to be heard, and they deserve to be heard because those countries have committed to the very same standards on the absolute prohibition on torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. I want to leave it here. I will just add that effectively there are a number of UN bodies that have voiced their concerns, and including on some of the cases here on the podium, including the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention of the United Nations. And one of the calls certainly with this meeting is also that those decisions deserve implemented, which they are not so far. So with that, I would like to really turn to the panel and be faithful to what we said we would do. We will have a first speaker who is not a victim of torture, but we felt it would be important to have him first to give a little bit a sense also of what he has seen in his practice in the United Arab Emirates. It's Toby Kaltman. He's a barrister specializing in war crimes, international crimes. He has served as legal counsel at the International Criminal Tribunal in Yugoslavia, on the special tribunals in Bangladesh, which was, I think, a doubtful exercise from the state perspective, the Bosnian War Crimes Chambers and others. And he has litigated, as I understand, a number of the cases that we are concerned here. So we would give him the first floor, and then we have the testimonies of the victims, which should be really the center of our discussions. Please.
Thank you very much. And just thank you for the organisers for calling this panel together to discuss what is a very important issue and a very timely issue, as our chair has indicated. The UAE has its Universal Periodic Review on Monday. And that's a particularly important process. Regrettably, it's not a process which is always followed up. We've seen a number of states recently go through that process with a large number of recommendations being made, with very little action being taken. But it is an important process nonetheless for states and other groups to voice their concerns over the human rights situation in a number of different states. So it is an important process. As has been stated, I'm a lawyer. I specialize in international human rights law. I've acted on behalf of a number of individuals who are victims of torture, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention in a number of states, and more recently in relation to the United Arab Emirates. In the interest of full disclosure, I represent one of the individuals on the panel, David Haig, who is a British national who was subjected to some of the most brutal forms of torture that you will hear today. One of the areas that we have been actively engaged is working with the authorities in the United Kingdom to ensure that those that carried out these awful acts against David are brought to justice. Of course, we don't have the ability to ensure enforcement of these rights in the United Arab Emirates, and that is deeply regrettable that there is not a more robust judicial system that is capable of addressing these issues. And as our chair has said, the protection of these rights and the procedural safeguards just do not exist in the United Arab Emirates. There is a culture of fear for those that fall into the hands of the authorities, that are arbitrarily arrested, in many cases for the most spurious of allegations, as certainly you'll hear from David today. There is a lack of proper legal representation. when they are held in arbitrary detention and when they are subjected to various different forms of ill treatment. Whilst we also predominantly are calling for those individuals to be held accountable, as you would expect in any jurisdiction, we also call upon the United Arab Emirates to fundamentally reform their criminal justice system. What we are seeing is a system which is abused by individuals in positions of power by using the courts, and a complete vacuum of accountability. It is the UAE's responsibility to implement a system where there is judicial independence and there is scrutiny of their criminal justice and their penal system. But that regrettably is not happening. We certainly hope on Monday that there will be a number of states that make very strong recommendations for there to be a fundamental overhaul of the entire system. As we've heard, the United Arab Emirates, as well as a number of other Gulf states, have signed and ratified a number of international human rights treaties. But regrettably, they are just pieces of paper that are signed by these states without any practical implementation. And of course, that culture has to change. Whilst we can applaud efforts to sign treaties such as the Convention Against Torture, the fact that no reports have been submitted is disturbing. There is also an obligation on the United Nations, as we have repeatedly called upon them to do so, through the special procedures and the working groups, to conduct a greater detailed assessment of this system. And we will continue to call upon the UN Special Procedures Branch to do that. I sincerely hope that these are some of the issues that will come up on Monday. There are two other issues that I'd like to briefly touch upon. And of course, I don't want to speak for too long because I want to ensure that you hear from the victims today so that you can hear firsthand what happens in this system. One of the concerns that I have as a British national is that the courts in the United Kingdom, the courts in the UAE are often staffed with international judges from countries such as my own. That gives credibility and legitimacy to many of these courts, which is deeply worrying. And this is something that we will be taking up, as we have done and will continue to take up with the British authorities, that it is simply inappropriate for judges of high standing to sit in courts that are providing legitimacy to a process which is abused and which is used to detain political opponents, individuals that have fallen out through commercial interests, and to use the judicial system to target such individuals. The other issue that I'd like to briefly raise as well, and it is a matter that we have taken up and will continue to take up, and my country is one of the greatest proponents in this, is that there is a disregard for human rights violations when the interest of trade surpasses those interests. The British government has a number of trade agreements with the United Arab Emirates and a number of other Gulf states, and particularly with the impending Brexit on the horizon, developing trade relations with those states seems to be more important than criticizing and calling for reform and actually prosecuting those individuals under universal jurisdiction in our courts. We often see a number of these individuals who are responsible from the United Arab Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, from Bahrain, on the streets of Knightsbridge, acting with total impunity, and that has to change. So there is a lot that can be done. There's a lot more that should be done. Monday hopefully will be the start of a new horizon for ensuring that the culture of impunity and a culture of arbitrary arrest, torture, and enforced disappearance that we are seeing frequently is promptly brought to an end. And we have to do everything we can to ensure that that starts to happen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What you said about the UK trade relation might be particular to the UK, but I don't think it is that particular to the UK. It would probably apply to many European countries and to the European Union as such. And I think it's maybe one issue to keep in mind indeed. I have now the pleasure to turn to Dr. Mahmoud Al Qaeda. I apologize in advance if any name is mispronounced here in this panel. I take all the blame for that. But before giving him the floor, I wanted to say one thing about torture and victims of torture. I think sometimes we use the term prevention of torture in a very abstract way. But when you work in this area, it's never abstract. It's always very concrete. It's always very direct. The impact on the individual, on the society, etc. And it takes a lot of courage to retake your life and rebuild your life. And it takes, I think, even more courage to sit here and speak about what you have suffered. So I have an incredible respect for having 4 people with me who have that courage to speak about this, and I hope we can all treat it with the respect that it deserves. Dr. Mahmoud Al Qaeda is, in a way, a little bit the mastermind of this meeting, because you brought all the victims together, and I think you have interesting plans here. He is a director and senior medical practitioner, so a different profile from the lawyers that are sitting on this part of the table. And he has been arrested, I think, in February 2013, and then subjected to arbitrary detention, ill treatment, torture, also confirmed by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention of the United Nations in a decision. And I give you the floor, and I think you will share your testimony. Thank you. Yeah, that's on.
This one is not working. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be with you today. And in fact, my personal target, to come and give this speech to expose the other face of UAE. Most of the people, they are thinking UAE is a developed country, having very high bridge, highways, but they don't know how they are treating the human rights there. And this is, as I have been a victim and have been exposed to these things, so I want to, for the media, for the history, to say the right and swear to say the right. I never had anything not happened to me. I will talk myself. I'm Dr. Mahmoud Al Qaeda, 56 years old, medical doctor, manager of healthcare in Qatar Petroleum, father of 8 children, married, and I have 8 children. So the objective is to highlight the injustice and torture during my captivity in UAE. So I was traveling from Thailand to Doha on 26th of February 2013, and while I was in Dubai, leaving to Doha, one person, he came and asked me at the passport counter. He asked me to come with him. As I am in the airport, really I didn't suspect that he, and for sure he is an official person. So I went with him to a room. Then he started asking me about a letter, anything do you have? I told him I don't have anything. So he started taking all my things. Then he asked me to join him to the police station to sign and clear the the interview had been done with me. I told him I cannot come with you till you give me, call my ambassador and I want to call my lawyer. He said, in the police station, you can ask them for these things, and you will have your lawyer. You can call to your ambassador. Unfortunately, when I come with them, and they keep me in a black GMC car. They tied my hands, tied my my eyes, and tied my feet. Then I found myself really, I don't know what's going on. He didn't show me any evidence that from the public prosecution that I should be captured or arrested. He didn't show me that he is a policeman even. So this is the start. So they drive me about 1.5 hours. Then I found myself in a cell. They asked me to change my clothes. Then they start the interview from 22nd of May till 3 days continuously without 1 minute sleep. They use all the type of torture, threatening me. They slapped me in my face, gave me punch in my stomach. They by stick, for all the air blindly, they are beating me by stick. All this concentrating that they are saying that I am bringing money to UAE, and I never really entered any single dollar to UAE and give it to any person there. So they used to threaten me. In fact, I was in a very bad situation. I asked for lawyers several times, but they didn't respond. When I was captured, I was about 52 years. In all the 52 years, I didn't hear lies as I was in this 2 years. They never say the truth. They never give you a promise, and they did it. And whatever they said, it's mostly they do the opposite. I suffered a lot. I was a known case of medical condition. I asked for to be referred to the hospital. They didn't refer me. They kept me. I had bleeding for 52 days. I was asking. I told them I am a medical doctor. I have a family history of carcinoma. I may have the same thing, but really they are ignoring. They are not taking care. I asked to talk to my family. They didn't really allowed me to talk to my family by phone. I don't know how. So all the bad torture, threatened. They threatened me that they are going to pull my nails. They asked me to be naked. They asked me. They said they will keep me in the electric chair. They didn't do it. They keep me sitting. They didn't give me the shot, but as as a response, you will give them whatever they ask you. And really, this is from the first day I decided that I will not, I told them, write whatever you want, I will sign it. But please release me and let me go to my family. And that time, my wife, she was admitted in the hospital. When I was arrested, my wife, she was in the hospital. And I was in very bad situation, really. Because of that, I decided to sign whatever they want me to. I stayed for 8.5 months in isolated and solitary cell. I was blind. I didn't see the sun. Even if I need the toilet, it's not easily to go to the toilet. You should ask their permission, and they take time. And I was in some medication, it's diuretics, make you need the toilets more, but they are not responding really. Sometimes you feel up to the severe pain that even you feel that you are going to urinate in yourself. So they mean to make you weak, that you follow their orders. when they I have stayed 8.5 months isolated. Then they refer me to the public prosecution. There I complain to the person there that I need human right. He told me this sentence: the human right will not do anything for you. They will make the things complicated. It's better for you to say that you did the things, then you will be released. So at day 14, after I have been arrested, they asked me to do a video film, and they directed me what I should say from all the interview they have did it before. Even during the interview, they are forcing me to say things. So I really, I feel weak, especially they are using they talk about my family, my children. So whenever they talk about this part, really I feel weak, and I want to join my family. And they give a promise for me that they are going to release me if I do that. So when they did the video, I told them whatever they want to do, really. And unfortunately, after I have been released, they used this video in the media, which puncture the wound again. The wound is because 2 years after I have been released, they put this video in the media. And I want to forget it, but they puncture the wound, and it caused very harm. I feel that I am withdraw from the community, from the work in front of my colleague. So it is very painful. As post-release, there was one point that I have been an antidepressant during the time when I was in, because really I couldn't sleep. For more than 2 weeks, I couldn't sleep. Maybe 2 hours a day I can sleep then. So this lead to depression. As post-release also, now I cannot travel to a lot of countries in GCC. No, I went to Bahrain, they returned me back. They have put the same film, which they put it in their media, and Bahrain channel, and Saudi news. So they destroyed my image, and I have brothers in Bahrain. I have a relative in Kuwait. I cannot go to Kuwait. I afraid to go even to Thailand, I cannot travel a lot of places. Also, they have arrested my son during the court. That also affect my son now, because he was also for one night, but also he was tortured, and they go the same scenario as they did for me, and they force him to have a video again, and to say my father is he is bringing money to UAE and supporting Muslim Brotherhood. So they are forcing us to say things that we didn't do it. So this is as post-release. There is also I suspect that human rights. I thanks all the really association and organisms. They supported me during my period when I was in UAE. A lot of people they really supported me, but still the effect it was not up to the level that they blame UAE. But I think there should be another action coming. Not blaming is not enough. So in summary, I was held against my will, no charge. There was no single evidence to them to prove that I did anything. I was tortured, no access to legal. I didn't see my lawyer all the period. I couldn't see a lawyer. Even there was in the court, there was a lawyer, but they didn't allow him to see me. There was no access to health care. There was no communication with my family, unable to travel freely. As I said, Bahrain, Kuwait, and lost 27 months of my life, managed by physical and mentally. I was really injured physically and mentally. This is it. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thanks to you. You said in the end this was 27 months of your life. When you summarize what happened, etc., it sounds very quick, etc., but imagine that 27 months of your life. I think you get more the dimension of what the suffering it might entail. What I take out of your presentation could be summarized on the no cause, no warrant, no charge, no location known, no access, no lawyer, no justice.
And we cannot appeal even.
Yeah. So I think it shows the almost Kafkaesque absurdity of the legal system that one person finds itself in this situation. And I think I also took note of you raised the long-term consequences that torture have. This is actually something that is very typical when we deal with torture, and this is why torture is not just a human rights violation like others. It has a long-term impact on individuals and society. I have now the pleasure to give the floor to Naji Hamdan. He is a US Lebanese citizen who came to the United Arab Emirates, I think, in 2006, and then was arrested in 2008. And the reason for arrest might be different, but what you suffered, I think, sounds similar. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. It seems that we have a technical difficulty here. Let me see. Can you?
Yeah, it's okay.
Right there. Actually, yeah, I'm Naji Hamdan, a U.S. citizen born in Lebanon. I'm an aerospace engineer and was a businessman by occupation. I will not go through the technicalities of detention. First of all, we just met. The panel here it's the first time that we meet, so we did not arrange anything, and even our speeches were not arranged together. There are lots of what Dr. Jida talked about. I already jot down on my paper, but I will surpass, and I will begin from where he ended. We all went through similar situations of torture, neglected from due process, and went through the Supreme Court of the State Security of UAE, and that is a court where the verdict is final and no appeal. The lawyers list comes to you, and you pick up from a list of lawyers that they give you, and so on. I worked with a friend of mine, an artist called Roy from the Philippines, on depicting some illustrations of what I went through in the dark side of the state security of UAE. I call it a dark side because it's a secret site. It's a dungeon that nobody knows about. Not even UAE citizens know that there are such sites in the UAE. These illustrations I'm planning to compile into a book that I will publish later on, but it's so many of them, I cannot talk about all of them, but these illustrations will give you the feeling and will let you know what I went through and my colleagues here went through. Some torture methods were intensified on some of us, and some were not, and some were implicated. The arsenal of torture in the UAE is huge. I've heard from others in the general prison of other torture methods that they were not inflicted on me, but basically there is torture in the UAE, and that's a fact. I don't know how to go through this. If I can go back. I want to choose because I have lots of them. I don't want to use all of them and the time is constrained.
المشكلة بالفرنسي مش فاهم شيء. لا في شغلة بتكبر الصورة.
I don't know. Actually, okay, we can start here. This is basically the cell. First, this is the GMC Dr. Jida was talking about. We all went through it. And the cell itself is a torture in itself. The solitary cell that they put us in is a torture without even doing anything to us. The cell is cold somehow, very much illuminated, and the walls are glossy white, so you barely can open your eyes during the 24 hours. It does not get dark, so it's a sleep deprivation, if you want to call it. This is one of the methods. I call him the ninja guy. He's the person in charge of the Nepali squad that serves the inmates. They bring us food. They're not UAE nationals. They bring food. They take us to the restrooms. And they take us to the interrogation rooms where we get beaten and tortured. The ninja guy, I call him the ninja guy because he dresses in black from top to bottom, and he appears and disappears at no time. In a split second, you see him over your head and pinching you with his button. And so I call him the ninja guy. Going to the restroom is a humiliating, degrading method that they use on us. Before you go to the restroom, you have to knock on the door. They have a bell button, but they rarely answer to that. You have to keep knocking on the door till one of the guards, the Nepali guards, come and open the door for you. You have to strip naked in front of him. He'll give you a towel. You strap it around your waist, and then he'll blindfold you. He handcuffs you, and then takes you to the restroom. We have a little illustration here of the bathroom. It's a short door, half open, and then he's watching everything you do inside. For the purpose of the press conference and the book, we only showed you the shower part of it. The electric chair. I was sat too on the electric chair. Most all my interrogations were while I was seated on the electric chair. However, they did not turn it on me. I was strapped to it, but it was not turned on me. The electric chair itself is a torture on its own, because the way they designed this electric chair is so weird that the back of it is curved out. Your back will be concaved in, and the bottom of it is going upwards, pinching you from the back of the knees, whereby your feet do not hit the floor. In a few minutes, you'll be numb from the bottom of your back all the way to the toes. And imagine that I was seated on this for 12 hours, 13 hours, 9 hours, and so on. Not only that, the guy that is interrogating me is behind a glass. He talks to me through a speaker, and I'm blindfolded, of course, but there are people in the room, UAE security personnel. And if the answer is not appealing to the interrogator, all kind of beating come to you, most to the head. And I passed out so many times during these interrogations, and I wake up on a puddle of water and slaps to my face. Okay, this I call the refrigeration room. I asked my friends here, no one was in it, but I was. And I know people from the general prison that experienced it as well. The refrigeration room, as the name calls it, it's a very cold room, no mattress, no cover, no nothing. You know, you sit on the floor, then you stand up, you move to the corner, you go knock on the door, nobody answers you. I stayed in it 24 hours, and then on and off in it. There was a ceramic room I learned about, but I did not experience the torture of it. This ceramic room is the opposite of the refrigeration room. And I know a person also told me in the white prison that he was in it, and as he called it, worse than the refrigeration room. This is the falaka. Most of the inmates experienced it, whereby they threw you on the floor, they threw me on the floor, and then I'm handcuffed to the back, blindfolded. A huge guy sits on my back, one knee to the lower back and another to the back of the neck. Then another person picks up the legs, put them under his arm, and a third person whip the sole of the feet. As soon as the guy lifted my legs, I hear pops in my back, and to this moment I suffer a disc in my lower back and one in my neck. I stayed like 2 weeks. I could not stand on my feet. I was being dragged to the interrogation room and so to the bathroom. And most of the inmates that I met later on told me that they went through this too. This is the kicking to the stomach. The person that is kicking me is a military official, high-ranking military official. I knew that from afterwards because of the dress they wear. It's a green uniform, military uniform, and burgundy boots. So this person, I'm on the floor, and this person is kicking me to the right side of my stomach. The first kick, I lost breath and passed out. Then they wake me up, he goes again to the right side, kicking as hard as he could to the right side. And then I pass out. Then he was teaching the people in the room, obviously there were some people in the room, that if you do this kicking, do it to the right side because all the organs of the right side are replaceable. And after I was released, a year and a half later, I had a surgery to my right stomach cover, I don't know what they call it, and there was a pinch to the liver, a dark spot in it because there was some internal bleeding earlier. I was taken to the doctor because I could not stand. I felt so sick. The doctor clinic is in another cell. I was taken to it also blindfolded and handcuffed. I could see from the bottom of the blindfold. The doctor was an Indian doctor, and I told him, I gestured to him that I need to talk to you, and he came closer to me, and I told him I was being tortured and I was beaten to the right of my stomach. And all he did, he put his hand on my right side and he said, "You're fine." I knew he couldn't do anything because there were people in the room and he can do nothing. The worst thing is that this older person in here, I call him the senior interrogator or the boss because I heard his voice all the time commanding the other officers or the other state security personnel. At one session, he came close to me, so close that he put his nose like 1 inch away from my nose, and he swore by God that he threatened me of reprisals against my wife, and he mentioned what we will do and that he will bring her to that room and do such and such if I did not sign or admit to what they want. And here I said, you know what, I'll just sign whatever you want. And I swear to God, at that moment, I was ready to sign anything. If they bring me a dead body, I will sign that I killed it. The signature is weird. Next day, they take me to the this person, and the guy stands behind me and puts stacks of paper in front of me, and he puts his left hand on it, and his right hand lifts the blindfold, and he mentions where for me to sign and put my thumbprint, and then he puts it back and turn the pages and do that until I finished, and then they transferred me back to the transferred me again to the Al Wathba prison, which is a general prison. I'm still traumatized, suffering as everyone else. This is something that you cannot forget overnight. It comes back to you every day, every other day. It stays there, but I want to tell the people of UAE that in your country there is torture, and big ones. And thank you for coming and for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for sharing this. I think it shows what torture really is, and then for the courage doing that. I'd now like to turn to a different life story, I think, to David Haig. He's a British citizen. Some of you might know that he was, as I understand, a football manager of Leeds United Football Club before he was caught up in a business dispute, as I understand, in the United Arab Emirates, and had to go through his own turmoil in this. Please.
Hey, come over. Come over. Sit over. No problem.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that don't know me and haven't heard about my story, my name is David Haig. 4 years ago, I was the managing director of Leeds United, a leading English football club. Life was good. I saw Dubai as my second home, and my consortium to purchase the football club was in the process of buying Leeds from its Dubai-based owners. I had no idea that what should have been a straightforward business deal would very quickly destroy my life. The deal we had been working on turned sour, and in the middle of the dispute, I was tricked into flying to the UAE from my home in Leeds. I thought I was going to Dubai to meet the UAE owners and resolve the disputes I had with them. However, within hours of stepping off the plane, I was imprisoned as part of a premeditated trap, and I spent the next 22 months detained in Dubai. I now know that the people I was doing business with, people who had direct connections to the UAE government, were complicit in this. The abuses I suffered during the time were so serious that upon my return to England, I was hospitalized for a total of 7 months, receiving various different types of surgery to my broken bones and in a psychiatric hospital for post-traumatic stress disorder. It has now taken me 22 months back home here in England, well, not here in England, obviously in Geneva, to start to rebuild my life, mind, as well as my broken body. I'm here with you today to tell the world what happened to me in that very dark Dubai, in the hope of exposing the ongoing suffering in the UAE jails, and to warn others of the terrible injustices that exist within the UAE legal system. I can tell you that the most basic human rights are denied to detainees and prisoners in the UAE. After I was arrested, I was detained without charge or investigation for 15 months. And most of the physical abuse that I suffered occurred during this time. During my incarceration, I was denied the opportunity to see the evidence against me, either before or during the so-called trial. I was not allowed to give evidence myself or to cross-examine witnesses or even to speak. Often, I wouldn't even be allowed in the court. I was regularly denied access to a translator and a lawyer, and often denied access to even a pen and paper. It's telling that I was only fully able to read the accusations against me some 22 months later when I'd returned home to England. These issues go straight to the heart of the UAE's human rights record, which the panel is examining today. International diplomacy, international relations, international trade, and the foreign policy of all states are in need of a healthy dose of honesty. We consistently see a hypocritical approach to human rights and civil liberties from numerous nations, states being guided by self-interest and trade as the driving force behind foreign policy. It's very much trade over torture. As a consequence, certain nations are scrutinized and publicly criticized, whereas others are seemingly given a free pass to act as they wish as long as the interests of other states are furthered. Governments, where they do not appear to be willing to publicly condemn or criticize, hide behind the veil of diplomacies. These issues have been discussed in meetings behind closed doors, as I was told by the UK Foreign Office when I complained about my treatment by the UAE. If we could see tangible results from these apparent discussions, the closed-door approach could be forgiven. The reality, however, is that whatever is being said behind these closed doors is having no effect, and thus, as a policy, it has failed, and has been failing for years. Countries such as Syria have been publicly criticised and condemned by numerous nations for mass human rights abuses and the torture of its own citizens. Of course, this is at the extreme end of the scale, but one must question why this condemnation is not extrapolated across other states. The answer to the question is one of self-interest. Given my own personal experience, it will come as no surprise that I focus on the United Arab Emirates. It is important that pressure on regimes with dubious human rights practices remains factually based, and therefore I believe I am best placed to focus on the United Arab Emirates, as that is the country where I have direct personal experience, and where I now have already represented hundreds of people detained and trapped in its legal and prison system. In violation of all internationally recognised statutes on torture and the treatment of prisoners, the UAE continues to torture people detained in prisons, police stations and holding centres. I do not seek to suggest that every individual suffers this fate, but it occurs with sufficient frequency to draw the conclusion that it is endemic, and therefore, even if it is not part of an officially sanctioned policy, it is certainly one that the government and its ministries are prepared to ignore. You have heard here today, or will hear, several first-hand accounts of torture and abuse, but there are countless others that are not here today, such as Ahmed Zidan, a young British citizen who was convicted of offences in the UAE following confessions extracted with the use of torture. Another British citizen, Lee Bradley Brown, died in police custody following allegations that he had been beaten and tortured to death by the Dubai police, having been detained for 6 days. I'll never forget the chilling threats I heard in May 2014 while I was being beaten by the Dubai police. "We kill Brits here," my abuser, a Dubai policeman, told me. I didn't know what they meant then, but I do now. I met Brits in jail that saw Lee's lifeless and broken body being dragged out of the solitary confinement cells in Dubai police station. That station is the same one where I spent 17 months of my life. I was wrongly accused, arbitrarily detained. I was threatened, abused, starved, beaten. I was electrocuted, and I was raped. It has taken a long time and an awful lot of treatment to be able to sit here and talk to you all in as much detail as I am. As a Briton, I expect more from my country, and as a human, I expect more from the international community. What happened to me has been reported to the English courts, the UAE, the United Nations, the UK Foreign Office. It has been fully accepted by the UK courts in countless UAE extradition hearings. Where then is the public condemnation from the UAE, from the UK, the US, and from those other stakeholders? Why is it that even corporates and law firms now believe it is acceptable to misuse the horrors of the UAE legal and prison system as nothing more than a corporate jail and a litigation tactic? Why is it that the UAE, and for that matter, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and those other states that routinely partake in such activities continue to escape the condemnation of the international community? Why is it that Bangladesh, a country that routinely, forcibly, and lawfully disappears civilians and members of the political opposition, escapes criticism? It is no coincidence that the UAE and those other countries I mentioned, for that matter, have strong trade links with the UK and another of other countries. The UK holds itself out as a bastion of human rights and a country that will support democracy and to seek to assist those that are prevented from exercising their fundamental rights and freedoms. The selective approach currently adopted, however, not only undermines its own position internationally, but it makes the situation in those countries much worse. To tolerate such abuse is to encourage it. The UAE is safe in the knowledge that there is no real consequence for its actions, and therefore there is no incentive for it to change. 4 years on, I am still fighting for justice for myself from the UAE. Even an apology would be a start, yet nothing has happened. The UK and numerous other countries, if they are truly serious in seeking to further democracy and human rights, and if they are truly serious in seeking to ensure that all citizens of all nations are free from oppression, need to dramatically change their position. The UK courts now clearly recognise the position in the UAE. For years, they have refused to extradite individuals from the UK to the UAE. To put it another way, an independent court has recognised on numerous occasions that there is a real risk of an individual being subjected to torture and/or associated human rights abuses, and therefore ought not to be extradited. Only 3 days ago, another UAE extradition request was rejected by the English courts. In another recent refusal by the English courts, the Scottish courts refused a similar request. I gave evidence for 2 days and was cross-examined by the UAE in that case. The judge, a Sheriff T. Welsh QC, concluded in a 70-page judgment that David Haig struck me as an honest, intelligent witness who gave his evidence with calm dignity. I have no doubt he was telling the truth about seeing a civilian lawyer who acted for his former employers in Burdabai police station in the company of a police officer pointing at him before being questioned and beaten by the police. I fully accept he was repeatedly seriously assaulted by Dubai police officers and tasered while detained in Burdabai police station. I accept he was interrogated and forced to sign a document in Arabic, the content of which he could not understand. I believe the account he gave of squalid, overcrowded and insanitary detention conditions. I further believe he was sexually assaulted and raped in the car park of that police station during his detention. It seems then that the position in the UAE is clear, and yet still the UK and other governments ignores this and misdirects. Actions must be followed by consequences. It cannot be correct that individuals such as me and the panel before you today, who have suffered at the hands of such regimes, are routinely ignored in the hope that we will eventually give up and go away. My message, therefore, is this: I am not going away, and I will not be silenced. And I imagine my colleagues and panel members will also not be doing that either. Not only that, but I am determined to spend my future helping others facing injustice in the UAE and elsewhere. We have all seen Dubai's gleaming towers edge ever closer into the skies. For me, the UAE justice system is growing the other way, leading humanity into the dark depths of hell. It is to the international community and the United Nations that we must now look to bring the UAE out of that darkness and hold the UAE to account for its flagrant human rights abuses. One of the strongest messages we can send to demonstrate our abhorrence of the UAE prison and justice system is to ensure that no member of our community has to face being extradited to the UAE to face this abuse. For this reason, I would ask the UN to support a recommendation to the British Prime Minister Theresa May and her government, and to governments around the world to suspend the extradition treaties with the UAE. In the light of this evidence you have heard here today, there is no good reason not to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking out. And you mentioned a lot the international community, the attention that has to be given to this. You will note that the schizophrenia in some ways that the United Kingdom is a country that has a formally adopted torture prevention policy by the Foreign Office. But I think torture prevention is not something abstract. It starts with how you recognize and how you deal with victims. I will come back to you later on this question about the endemic and systemic, because when I've seen some of the previous testimonies, if not systematic and widespread, if you set up a system like we've seen on the screens that you showed, which is a little bit the precursor to, is it a crime against humanity, widespread systematic policy of torture here, maybe that's a point to take. But I leave it to you afterwards. I'd like now to turn to, as our last witness, but not as our last witness, because I think he has something very important to tell us. Khalid Ahmad, he is presently, as I understand, living in Sweden. He's of Palestinian origin. He went, I think, first in 2007 to Dubai and to the United Arab Emirates. And the ordeal, quite similar in a way, started, I think, in 2010, but I ask you to tell us your story.
Yes,
and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Well, I will start with the previous video, very short. First of all, I will thank all of you for beginning here, and of course I would thank International Campaign of Freedom in UAE. As we saw in the video, that was summary of my story, but even though it was that don't show how much pain and suffering I have been through. It was the worst nightmare I ever had. To say least, it was evil and crime act, not made for a human. Emirati government trying to track the world to appear as modern and luxury life and country of freedom and open country for all. I arrived to Abu Dhabi 2007 with a lot of dream of. I was excited. I was thinking I will have luxury and great life. I never thought that it was like just one step to the hell. I work in the company which is owned by Sheikh Saif bin Zayed Al Nahyan, which is here interior affair and Deputy Prime Minister of UAE. The company called International Investment Company. I worked as an IT specialist. I worked hard for like 3 years. I was working work really hard. So the owner of the company and my management expand my work. So I have more work to the Sheikh Balas and his own laptop and his own villa and his own palace as well, his own network, his own private office in Al Ain. So I saw a lot of information, but I never keep any of that outside of the company. In 2010, I was on vacation in Syria to my family with my friend. And as soon as I came back to Abu Dhabi, they arrested me after like 2 steps out of the plane with two guys. They didn't show me any ID. They are police, or they don't show anything that like arrest warrant or something. They just arrest me, and they told me, come with us to the. We'll have a few questions of you. We'll ask you a few questions, and after that you can go home. They took me to the VIP room. I sit there for like 10 minutes. Then they took me to the outside of the airport without stamping my passport, without seeing anyone. And they put me in black GNC. They covered my eye. They tied me with tied my hand, tied my legs. And they drove me in the like 30 minutes at least. I don't know where, because I was covered my eyes. Even if I saw the car window was really dark and black, you can't see anything from inside. So they drove me to my house. They searched my house without any searching warrant, searching paper, without telling me what's going on. They just asked me for the key. They opened the house. They take everything, CDs, laptop. They even take the router. And that point, I know this guy is they don't know what they are doing. They open they open everything in the house. They take everything. Then they ask me where I keep my file and my stuff. So I told them, this is my laptop, this is my personal laptop, this is my hard disk. Take whatever you want and look at it. So they took me to the security present. I didn't know where is it, but like Mr. Naji said and Mahmoud, it was the same, exactly the same. First day, they make me lie in my stomach. They beat me with a stick to my legs for at least 6 hours. After that, they make me stand up and jump while they asking question about the leaking information from the company and where I saved the information and etc. I told them I was on vacation in Syria, and I hear there is something problem with the company. If I am guilty, if I feel I am not innocent, I will not come back for sure. But as well, they don't believe me. They start torturing me, beating me, insulting me with bad names, with insulting my family, insult everything. They treat me like I'm not even human. The second day, they take me to this chair that Mr. Naji showed, but they did it. They turn it on for like every time it was like 30 seconds. I bust out, then I wake up again while they threw cold water on me, and they start asking me the same over and over question. Then I give up after like first time of the electricity. I told them, listen, bring me the piece of paper. I will sign it, whatever you want, and just leave me alone. I mean, this kind of torturing, nobody can hold it. So for the first 3 days, they didn't let me to sleep. Every time I try to sleep, they knock the door or they throw the cold water on me. They keep asking the same over question. They kidnapping me without any warranty, banish warrant. In the first day, they told me, the investigation told me, there's no lawyer, there's no court, there's no human rights here. You have to say what we want you to say. So they kept me for 5 months. The first 3 months they was treat me like I'm piece of animal. They treated me like I'm not even have any right for living, insulting me all the time, torturing me. But after like there's 3, even I stopped eating because I just all I want to have just see the sun. So I stopped eating for like 5 days, just because I want to see the sun. That's all I asked them to have. In the end, they let me out. They said, "Okay, we are sorry. We don't find anything against you, and but you have to leave the country." As simple as that. So they booked me a flight and they let me go. No, that's all. In the end, I just want to say one more thing. As I am now, I'm just looking for justice, nothing more, from Sheikh Saif and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, and for Sheikh Hazza and Hisham Hamid, which was the manager for the company. I just want justice, nothing less, nothing more. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much for sharing this. I think just wanting to see the sun is something that I will, when I go home, think about. Thank you very much for your testimony. I think we've heard 4 stories that are all different life stories in some ways, but are very similar in what has happened. I think they show that torture is not a coincidence. There's an institutionalized system that takes torture as the prime element in the justice system. It's not a bad apple or rotten apple where abuse happens, where somebody's beaten up, but it's a structured, institutionalized system. And alongside with that, it doesn't have anything of the safeguards because, of course, they would only disturb in that system. I think one of the things we wanted to do here today is to share these stories because they are rarely heard. When I speak about the Gulf countries, for example, the United Arab Emirates, I'm often told, well, that's a different world, that's a different culture, we have to judge this differently. We don't judge it differently when it comes to commerce. We don't judge it differently when we transfer airports, etc., and have modernity. If we listen to that, we cannot judge this differently to torture elsewhere. And I think that's one of the first pleas. We want in this final part of the session, before we really want to have questions as well, have a brief comment by Maître Mombré, and I think you also have an announcement that you want to do about how you want to go forward, which I think is very important. But maybe first I have Maître Mombré say a few words as a sort of comment on what he has heard. For those of you who are not familiar with Maître Mombré, he's really a specialist here in Geneva and in Switzerland on universal jurisdiction cases. He's a co-founder of a partner organization of All of Us Trial here in Geneva. He's a longtime friend of the OMCT. In many battles we've fought for similar type of cases. And it's really my pleasure to have you here and hear your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerald. As you have mentioned at the beginning, Gerald, UAE has now ratified the Convention Against Torture. Was it in
Yeah.
2013? So what we can see here, what becomes more and more clear is that this ratification has not changed a lot, apparently. Because there is a strong obligation under the convention to prosecute all perpetrations of tortures. And actually, as it has been seen in many cases, there is no prosecution at all in the UAE courts regarding crimes of torture that are committed within the UAE territory. Just to start with, Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture, a short definition. For the purposes of this convention, the term torture means act by which severe pain of suffering, whether physical, mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain and suffering is inflicted by or at the investigation, etc., will have to be followed by criminal sanctions. As we have seen here in all your testimonies, we have very severe acts of torture that have been committed, and unfortunately, no prosecution is coming after those perpetrations. According to the convention, however, if each state party shall take effective legislative, administrative, judicial, or other measures to prevent acts of torture in any territory under its jurisdiction. And Article 4, each state party shall ensure that all acts of torture are offenses under its criminal law. The same shall apply to an attempt to commit torture and to an act by any person which constitutes complicity or participation in torture. So the problem now that we are facing in the UAE country is that the perpetration of torture is going on without apparently any measures being taken and without any trial being put in place, without anyone being prosecuted for having committed such crimes. So here comes the issue of universal jurisdiction. That brings us the issue of universal jurisdiction. At least from 1995 and the very famous case that I had the chance to follow at that time, the issue of independence of justice is a real issue in the UAE. The lack of independence makes it impossible to bring a case against police in the UAE court. That brings us, as I just said, to universal jurisdiction. Is it possible to bring a case against police officers, against military officers in other courts, in other countries, regarding perpetration of torture? Yes, it is possible. And this is the aim of the Convention Against Torture. It is an obligation for each party that has ratified, which is party to the International Convention Against Torture, to prosecute any torture perpetrator that comes within its territory. Of course, the torture of the national who has been tortured, like your case, should also, of course, act, even if the perpetrator has not come to its territory. But let's take the case of Switzerland, according to Article 6 of the Swiss Criminal Code, if a crime perpetrator, wherever the crime occurred, comes to Switzerland, Switzerland has the duty to prosecute, to arrest him and to prosecute him wherever the crime was perpetrated and whoever the perpetrator was. This is also an obligation according to Article 5, paragraph 2 of the Convention Against Torture. Each state party shall take such measures as may be necessary to establish its jurisdiction over such offences in cases where the alleged offender is present in any territory under its jurisdiction and it does not extradite him pursuant to Article 8 to any of the states mentioned in paragraph 1 of this article. So, if a crime perpetrator comes to Switzerland, this crime perpetrator has to be arrested and put into trial in the Swiss courts, even if this person has come but has left, and we have knowledge that this perpetrator has come to any place in Switzerland, then a Swiss prosecutor has to open a criminal case against this perpetrator, because if this person came once, it is admitted that this person can come a second or a third time. So this is very important, and this brings hope for crime perpetrators in the UAE to be prosecuted. Of course, that brings us to another issue: how to know, how to be aware of the movements of those persons. This is the important. This is one of the important tasks of your organization, of the World Organization Against Torture. Those persons to be sure that those persons are known, to be sure that the information circulates where they move, where they go, so that they can be prosecuted. And lawyers, as us, must be ready at the minute there is knowledge of somebody having come to another jurisdiction, that a claim can be filed and this person be prosecuted. I think this is broadly the situation. I will be very happy to answer your questions if more details are required. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I just add that this. I think this is certainly one of the possibilities to discuss in a case like the United Arab Emirates. Sometimes this sounds abstract, but Maître Mambré has had practical cases where this has been done and used. But of course, the primary target is that the policy changes in the country. And I think you wanted to make some announcement in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. We have met today to each other, and really first time we are seeing each other. And each person did his own effort to against the torture again. So we decided that we should work together and create an association, work against the torture, especially in UAE, as aware of victims of UAE torture. So we established an association for victims of torture in UAE. We have met today, and as the law of Switzerland allowed that, we have established the association from today, which will take care more in the media and following the torture in UAE and following the victims, and we try our best to stop this, what's going on. And thank you very much.
Thank you for this announcement, and I just want to add, as Secretary General of the World Organization Against Torture, we are a network of civil society organization against torture. I would be happy to discuss with you how we can support you in this undertaking.
Thank you.
But I think time has come. It took a little bit longer than we anticipated, but I think it was important that we heard all the testimonies. And I think at least for myself, I will go out of this room with a very different understanding of what is happening than before. But the time has come also to have you with questions. If you could raise your hand, quickly introduce yourself, and if ideally not long comments, but questions. Who wants to take the lead? Who wants to start? The lady there, please.
Barbara Bibot from Al Jazeera English. I'd like to follow up with a question to Mr. Membres. So if I got it right, you said the perpetrators could be prosecuted in another country because the UAE is signatory to the Convention Against Torture, right? And the victims, I suppose, would not file a case against the UAE police in the UAE because there's not an independent judiciary. Now, would they file a case against the UAE police in any other country? And which are the international tribunal or frameworks they could refer to if they want to file a case now against the UAE police? I mean, how do they act now?
The importance here is to have a knowledge of the movements of the perpetrators in other countries, because it's only ordinary courts of the different countries where claim can be filed. And the difficulty is that there must be the presence, the perpetrator of torture has to be present in a jurisdiction, and the courts of this jurisdiction has the obligation to prosecute this person. But the point is to have knowledge that a perpetrator has been traveling somewhere in order to file a claim in the courts where he has arrived. I don't know if you want to...
But it's virtually impossible for them to know the names or, I mean, who has tortured them. I mean, there must be another way to be able to prosecute, I mean, to start a case against the UAE government as such, right?
It is true that it's a real difficulty to have the name of the perpetrators, but you can also imagine to prosecute the superiors, the police chief of staff, for example, who has knowledge, who is supposed to have knowledge of what happened. But this is true. The difficult issue here, and this is why there are not so many cases, is that it's difficult to have to prove that such person was involved in a torture perpetration, and that such person has traveled somewhere. Maybe you want to...
Yeah, perhaps I can add to it. I mean, part of your question was framed for international jurisdiction. There is no international jurisdiction to deal with this, other than through the UN human rights system. But that's not criminal jurisdiction. That's a human rights monitoring process. There are a number of countries that have a history of taking on cases under universal jurisdiction. Obviously, the work that the trial has done here in Switzerland and elsewhere shows that there is a history, there is the ability to take cases against individuals for extraterritorial crimes. The United Kingdom, the jurisdiction is fairly limited as far as torture is concerned, and you focus on an important point, because under UK law, we can't prosecute the superiors under any kind of doctrine of superior responsibility or command responsibility. We can only prosecute the individuals who carried out the acts of torture. So we had a very disappointing ruling last year in relation to a Nepalese colonel who had overseen, as it was alleged, overseen acts of torture. Because he hadn't, or it couldn't be proven that he'd carried out the torture himself, he was acquitted. So that does provide somewhat of a limitation. But when you're looking at these cases, so David's case, for example, which we are working closely with SO15 in the Metropolitan Police, which is the unit responsible for war crimes and torture investigations, David knows where he was detained, under whose responsibility that fell. And in many cases, a lot of these individuals know the names of the individuals that were carrying out these acts, because it's with such a level of impunity that these individuals do not believe that they'll ever be brought before a court. What we have worked on with the Metropolitan Police is not only notifying them of the individuals that we know or we believe were involved, but it's then incumbent upon the investigative and prosecuting authorities to actually obtain the information as to who has responsibility for that particular facility, who was working on that particular day. So there are ways around it, but of course there are certain limitations. There are other jurisdictions where you don't need to have that information. What I think is particularly important about the Swiss jurisdiction, which is different certainly to UK, is that if that individual has entered the jurisdiction once, that effectively is a green light for the authorities to initiate an investigation. That's a very important protection against human rights abuses that not many other European countries have. The difficulty that we have in the United Kingdom is that these cases cannot effectively go forward unless those individuals are physically within the jurisdiction. Now, that requires a great deal of coordination and communication from the various different groups, and that's why I think the initiative that has been set out today is very important, because we need to be able to identify when individuals are entering certain jurisdictions and be able to work very closely with lawyers in that country that can get a case moving quite quickly, because invariably you have a very short window of opportunity in order to get these cases forward. So I can say from myself and the organisation that I represent that it is a very important initiative that we give our full support to, because this is important.
Maybe we take 2 or 3 together.
Okay.
Anybody else? Then you shoot first.
Okay. My name is Eliane Schenk. What about ICC in Den Haag? Couldn't it take up the case?
Maybe we take another.
The ICC jurisdiction is extremely limited, and it's limited to those countries that have signed and ratified the Rome Statute, those countries that have given the ICC jurisdiction, and cases that have gone before the UN Security Council that have been referred to the International Criminal Court. Now, as we heard earlier, it may well be that these crimes are on such a systematic or widespread nature that it constitutes crimes against humanity. But I would be very surprised if the United Arab Emirates is going to be rushing to ratify the Rome Statute in very much the same way that none of the other countries in that area are likely to do the same. So the ICC has no jurisdiction to deal with the United Arab Emirates at this current time. And it's highly unlikely that this would ever be on the agenda of the UN Security Council to refer it, unfortunately.
I have 2, a lady more or less straight there for me and a gentleman to her right.
Thank you very much. As a fellow lawyer, I wanted to ask, I wanted to ask the 2 members in the panel. If we follow this logic, then for Switzerland, it's possible to prosecute someone under the doctrine of the superior responsibility, of the responsibility of the superior. But then, could we go as high as the Ministry of Interior, for example, and how would immunity of state officials play in this picture?
Maybe we take the question of the gentleman to the right as well.
Thank you very much for the panel. Amanda Thomas-Johnson from the Middle East Eye. My question actually is to Naji in particular. I just wanted to know the reaction of the US authorities in terms of helping you to extricate you from the torture and treatment that you were undergoing.
Yes, this is true. In Switzerland, we have the possibility to prosecute the superior, the person who was in charge of the police, for example, and who who at least allowed the perpetrations to occur. And of course, especially the interior minister. There have already been cases, and I have followed once, a case against the Ministry of Interior in case of torture perpetrated when he was in office, in charge of his office. And there is no immunity in case of torture. And nobody can hide, a minister cannot hide himself against immunity if he's prosecuted against torture. It's two different types of immunity. One is according to his present position when he is prosecuted. So it might be that he cannot be prosecuted if he's still a minister. But then prosecution will be able to start as soon as he will no longer be in charge of office. It's two different types of immunity that I can explain you later if you want in more details. I don't know if you want to have something about immunity.
Yeah, and I can give a practical example. There have been a number of cases, certainly our group filed a case in Spain against 7 senior members of the Syrian military intelligence under the doctrine of command responsibility, because we don't know who was specifically involved with acts of torture and execution. There are also 3 cases currently pending with the German federal prosecutor for similar conduct, and also before the French courts, again, for similar conduct on the basis of superior responsibility. So, of course, it can be done. In terms of immunity, Francois is entirely correct that there is no immunity at a ministerial level. There's no functional immunity as far as allegations of torture are concerned. Of course, there are a number of states that recognize head of state immunity. And also, just very quickly, a number of cases that were filed in the United Kingdom over the last couple of years that relates to Egypt and Bahrain. There was the Crown Prince of Bahrain who travels quite frequently to the United Kingdom and is alleged to have been involved in acts of torture. He asserted immunity, and that was actually not accepted by the UK courts. They didn't say that the case could go forward, but he couldn't rely on functional immunity as a result of being a member of the Bahraini royal family.
But I mean, there are many other ways how the plight of victims can be recognized and they can be supported. I'm very happy you raised this question about when you're speaking. I was asking a little bit the same. Did you have the same experience as David? Rather disappointing. What did the US do to take up your interests?
Actually, the US government position was null. They did nothing except for the visits of the US consul to me during my detention at the general prison. And actually, I believe, and lawyers from GNO, non-profit organizations and so on in the United States believe that I was a victim of proxy detention, what's so-called proxy detention, which is whereby the US orders another government from the kind of the UAE to arrest a US citizen in order to do what they did to me. So this is it. Unfortunate.
Any other question to our witnesses here? Last chance. Well, then I think it's time to conclude this panel. I want to there are 2 at the end, but those are then the 2 last. Okay, 1. Okay. Do you have a question?
Yes. Can I?
Yes, quick.
I will do it in French.
En français.
Monsieur, bonjour. Vu que, comment dirais-je, cet État, je parle des Émirats arabes, est un État qui ne respecte pas les lois internationales. Pareil pour l'Arabie saoudite, Pareil pour le Bahreïn. Il y a des gens qui ont été torturés. Pour nous, on a des témoignages concrets. On a des vécus. Ils ont vécu ça dans leur chair. Pourquoi ne pas essayer, vu que les États fonctionnent, comme tout le monde le sait, par des États pour des intérêts économiques, pourquoi que la société civile, la presse, on s'unit là, on fait une campagne de dénonciation de ces États criminels? Parce que ce qui s'est passé contre ces messieurs-là, c'est des crimes contre l'humanité. On ne peut pas laisser passer ça. Et l'ambassade des Émirats Arabes Unis, et l'ambassade, enfin les consulats et l'ambassade d'Arabie Saoudite sont là. On peut, nous, sortir de là et aller les voir. Et leur dire, stop, stop talk. We cannot accept this anymore. On ne peut plus accepter vos crimes. Ça, c'est des crimes. Ces messieurs-là ont vécu des tragédies. Et merci.
I think you probably more or less understood that he said yeah. So I don't have to translate it. I think part of the purpose of this panel was to make that statement, because sometimes it sounds very abstract when we speak about human rights in the UPR. It's very sanitized. This was not sanitized, and there are many more people who have suffered the same way. And I think it's very important that we raise all the pulls and triggers we have. There's a legal arm to this with universal jurisdiction and other things we've heard. There's the UN where we have to bring those things to the attention. And you know, the United Arab Emirates last time in 2013 accepted the recommendation to investigate cases of torture. But what we have seen is not there's a case of torture, please investigate. It's a policy of torture. So I think we have to speak that language. We also have to speak about how we mobilize, how we make it heard. This is not outer space, this is real space. And I think one of the things that we at the OMCT have learned over the years again and again, legal recognition is one thing, but there are many, I think one of you mentioned, they didn't even apologize. And I think it starts with recognizing what you have suffered and the needs that you have and the rights you have to repair and retake your life. And I think that's at the core of the session today. And I wish you all the best for that journey. And if we collectively can be part of this journey, we would be delighted. A big thank you for your courage, for being with us. This needs to be heard much more often in many more forums. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.